There is a geography of innocence, places and times that, in our memory, remain bathed in a perpetual, golden light. For the small town of Glen Ellen, Illinois, the summer of 1985 was meant to be another one of those golden chapters. It was the peak of an era of analog simplicity, a time before digital screens became the windows to the world and cell phones chained people to a leash of constant connectivity. Life was lived outside, on the warm asphalt of the streets, on the green lawns of the parks, and in the wild fields that served as secret kingdoms between the neighborhoods and the small shops. Freedom was measured by how far your bicycle could take you, and the only universal rule was to be home when the streetlights came on, a gentle curfew announced by the electric hum of the coming night. It was a trust woven into the very fabric of the community, a silent promise that evil was a distant fiction, something confined to movie screens or the pages of a paperback novel. But every golden age has its twilight. In Glen Ellen, the dusk arrived abruptly and brutally on a Sunday afternoon in July, brought by a monster who walked like a man. This is the account of how darkness found the light, how a community lost its soul, and how science, decades later, finally lit a candle in a darkness that had seemed endless. Christy Wesselman was the personification of that summer's light. At 15 years old, she possessed an energy that seemed to make the world spin a little faster around her. It wasn't just her popularity in school or her undeniable talent in sports that defined her, but rather an innate kindness and a contagious optimism that drew people into her orbit. As vice president of her class, she was not just a figurehead but a peacemaker, a loyal friend. She dreamed of the future with the vivid clarity that only youth allows, perhaps becoming a teacher to inspire other children, perhaps traveling the world to see places she only knew from books. To her family, she was the center of a loving universe. To her friends, she was the glue that held them together. That summer, between remedial classes and softball games under the setting sun, life was a succession of simple, perfect moments. One of those moments, on July 21st, would take her down a familiar shortcut, a beaten dirt path that cut through a field of tall grass, a green corridor that for the neighborhood kids was a territory of adventure and secrets, but which would soon become a hallowed and haunted ground, the ground zero of a tragedy that would redefine the town forever. The decision was trivial, born from a teenage craving on a lazy afternoon, a soda and a chocolate bar. The Wesselman home was immersed in that Sunday calm, the air heavy with heat and the distant sound of lawnmowers. Christy's words, "I'll be right back," were spoken with their usual lightness, a domestic refrain that, in retrospect, would become a phrase of excruciating agony. And so began her mother's vigil, an invisible clock marking the stages of a nightmare. At first, there was patience. At 4:15 p.m., a casual glance at the kitchen clock. At 4:45 p.m., patience gave way to a slight irritation. Where did that girl get to? By 5:30 p.m., the irritation had curdled into a cold knot of anxiety in her stomach. A mother's mind is a battlefield between logic and fear. Logic whispered plausible excuses. She met friends, stopped to talk, lost track of time as teenagers do. But fear, an older and more primal voice, began to drown out logic, screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The silence of the house became deafening. The telephone, once an object of connection, became an instrument of desperation. One call, then another, and another. The politeness in the voices of other parents was almost worse than ignorance. "Sorry, Mrs. Wesselman, we haven't seen her today." Each no was a closing door, locking her in a rising corridor of panic with no exit. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, The darkness invading her mother's soul was far deeper and more permanent. Unable to bear the stillness, she went outside, the familiar street. The setting for so many years of happy memories now seemed alien and hostile. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every car headlight turning the corner was a split second of wild hope, followed by a crushing wave of disappointment. She ran down the shortcut, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her daughter's name a silent scream on her lips, a sound she dared not utter as if giving voice to the fear would make it real. Christy's absence was now a physical presence, a vacuum that consumed all the air, a crushing pressure in her chest. The night brought with it a terrible certainty, and with it, the call to the police, a final surrender to the reality she had fought so hard to deny. The official search began under the shroud of darkness, with flashlight beams cutting through the night, but they were looking for a girl who had already been swallowed by a much deeper darkness. The next morning's dawn brought no relief, only a cold, gray light that exposed the brutality of the situation. It was a seasoned detective, with eyes that had already seen the worst of humanity, who felt the dark pull of the field. He walked the path not as a cop on a search, but almost as a pilgrim approaching a desecrated altar. And then he saw it. The tall, dewy grass parted to reveal the unthinkable. The scene was a silent, horrific contradiction. The brutality of what had happened there stood in stark contrast to the serene beauty of the summer morning. The police work began, methodical and grim. Photographers capturing the horror, forensics experts combing every inch of earth, the yellow police tape creating a sharp border between the normal world and the epicenter of the nightmare. The community watched from a distance, in shocked silence, the illusion of their small town's safety shattering before their eyes. The autopsy confirmed the worst fears with clinical, agonizing detail, but it also offered a single, minuscule hope, a microscopic fragment of the perpetrator. Under Christy's fingernails, mixed with the evidence of her desperate fight for her life, was the DNA of her attacker. In 1985, DNA analysis was a science in its infancy, more theoretical than practical for most police departments. They had the killer's genetic code, his biological signature, but they had no way to read it. It was like finding a book written in an unknown, ancient language with no dictionary to translate it. The sample was carefully preserved, a whisper frozen in time, a silent witness locked away in the darkness of an evidence freezer, awaiting a technological revolution that was still years away. The mystery of the missing pearl ring added a layer of calculated cruelty. The killer was not just an impulsive predator. He was a collector, a thief of lives and memories, who took with him a macabre trophy of his conquest. The manhunt began, but it was like hunting a ghost. The lack of evidence at the scene was baffling and maddening. The killer had left no footprints, no fibers, no fingerprints. He had moved through the town with a terrifying, surgical precision. Fear spread through Glen Ellen like a plague. Sales of locks and deadbolts soared. Children, once free, were kept under anxious watch. The shortcut through the field became a forbidden place, a silent monument to the fear that now ruled the town. Longtime neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion. Every man walking down the street was a potential suspect, silently appraised. The town, once a haven, had become a prison of fear. In this cauldron of panic and pressure, the investigation desperately needed a face for the evil, and that face, tragically, became Dana Henry's. His proximity to the crime scene and his initial refusal to provide DNA were enough to chain him to the crime. He was subjected to relentless interrogations. His life turned inside out. The press tried him, and the community convicted him. To be finally exonerated by the power of science was an empty victory, for the truth could not restore his reputation, his money, or his peace of mind. Dana Henry became the second victim of Michael Jones, a man whose life was permanently scarred by the shadow of a crime he did not commit. And then, silence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The Christy Wesselman case went cold. The vibrant investigation became a frigid file. The case folder, growing thicker with useless reports and false leads, migrated from a detective's desk to a file cabinet, and from the cabinet to the depths of a cold case storage room, a paper tomb. It became an urban legend, a cautionary tale told to new residents. The original detectives, haunted by the failure, retired, passing the burden to younger faces who knew Christy only as a faded photograph. For the world, life went on. But for Christy's mother, time froze on July 21st, 1985. She became the guardian of her daughter's memory, a lone wolf fighting to keep the case from being forgotten, writing letters, giving interviews, refusing to let the silence win. Christy's friends grew up, graduated, married, had children, and grew older. Christy remained forever 15, frozen in the faded photograph on her headstone. 30 years, an entire generation. In 2015, in an anonymous lab hundreds of miles away, a lab technician was running a routine analysis. He fed a sample from a long-archived case into a DNA sequencing machine. The machine, a miracle of modern science, did in hours what had been impossible for decades. It translated the ancient message in the bottle. A powerful algorithm compared the genetic sequence against millions of others in the FBI's national database, a library of criminals. And then, it happened. Not with a bang, but with a quiet beep, a line of green text glowing on a computer screen. Match found. The ghost finally had a name. The name that appeared was not from Glen Ellen, nor from any of the long lists of suspects. It was the name of a 62-year-old man, Michael Jones, recently arrested for a domestic violence case, a career criminal whose history was a series of missed chances by the justice system. His early release for good behavior in 1983 had put him back on the streets, free to hunt. Detectives uncovered his motorcycle trips, his routes that passed near Glen Ellen like veins on a map. They realized with a dawning horror that Christy was not a planned target, but a victim of the most terrible of coincidences, the intersection of an innocent young girl's path with that of a predator on the move. While detectives unraveled his dark past, Michael Jones was living his mundane life, completely unaware that the ghost of a 30-year-old crime was about to break down his door. For Christy's mother, the phone call from the police was an electric shock to the heart, a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. The monster that had haunted her nightmares finally had a name and a face. Justice, for so long a distant mirage, was now a real and tangible possibility. The trial was the somber epilogue to a 3-decade saga. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of his own DNA, Michael Jones pleaded guilty. The 80-year sentence ensured that he would never again see the light of day as a free man. In the courtroom, worlds collided. Christy's family, aged by grief, but standing tall. Dana Henry, in the gallery, a silent witness to the justice that had come too late for him. And the killer, an old and broken man, the personification of a life wasted on violence. The closing of the case did not heal the wounds. There is no cure for such a loss, but it brought answers. It brought an end to the torture of uncertainty. The story of Christy Wesselman is a painful testament to the darkness that can hide just beneath the surface of everyday life. But it is also a story of perseverance, of a mother who never gave up, of detectives who never forgot, and of science itself, which worked silently over the decades until it could finally give a voice to a victim and name her killer. The summer of 1985 in Glen Ellen was interrupted, but the memory of Christy Wesselman and the search for truth in her name had finally found peace.